Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Steve Ward. On the High Strangeness Factor, we explore all aspects of the paranormal and the unexplained, from the past to the present, and seek out the underlying parallels and patterns that connect what we may think of as different categories of the unknown. Andy Mercer, welcome back.
Hello.
Nice to have you back in the, I guess it's a co-host seat or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Now, I know that you've got a bunch of stuff. Have many irons in the fire going right now. And some of them are kind of top secret at this moment, and they cannot be revealed.
Slightly, yes. I mean, my new book is out, as we were talking about earlier in the week. My book on the Dante's Inferno, the occult elements of that, have come out of Three Hands Press. That was literally the last couple of days that finally came out, which I'm very pleased with. And I'm just waiting for my own copies to come over from the States. But I know a few people have already ordered it, which is good to know. My book on the runes, the second edition, should be out within the next week or so, hopefully. So I can talk about that perhaps next time. But that's finally going to see the light of day. And another little project I've been working on, which I'm hoping to launch probably around Christmas time, is also moving forward nicely, but I don't want to say too much more about that just yet. But I am really pleased the book on the Dante's Inferno is now out. That was my project for the summer. Got that done and dusted, and had a few last minute changes to make, which got sorted out, and now it's out and available. So I'm really pleased about that.
Well, very good. I know you were actually too busy to be on a radio show or two, so keeping your nose to the grind. I'm supposed to be writing as well, but I don't have. Being a retired gentleman, when I should have more time. I'm not quite that disciplined just yet, I don't think. So the top secret stuff is going to be revealed in just maybe a week or two.
Probably in around December. Originally, I was going to launch this whole thing around Halloween time was the plan, but I've just got a bit waylaid, so basically getting this book finished. As you know, I also work full time, so that kept me a little bit busier, although it's reasonably quiet at the moment. But no, it's something I've been working on probably since last year, but I finally want to get it kind of up and running, and it will be announced to the world in general when it's ready to go, which probably will be about December time. But the Rune book, that's the other one that should be out hopefully next week. So it's all guns blazing at the moment. I'm now working on the second edition of my first book I wrote, which was on Enochian magic a few years back. So that's got its publisher lined up already. But that won't be out till next year now, I expect. Well, definitely won't be out till next year, maybe the year after. But certainly keep myself busy with all that stuff.
Well, I have seen a sneak peek to some of the top secret stuff, and it's worth waiting for it, just so people will keep an eye out for it. Okay, let me introduce our guest tonight. Nick Redfern is the author of more than 60 books, including Keep Out, For Nobody's Eyes Only, Immortality of the Gods, Top Secret Alien Abduction Files, Men in Black, Bloodline of the Gods, Contactees, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, and Weapons of the Gods. He has been on many television shows, including the Travel Channel's In Search of Monsters, History Channel's Unexplained and Monster Quest, Sci-Fi Channel's Proof Positive, and the National Geographic Channel's Paranatural. Nick, welcome to the High Strangeness Factor.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for being here. We've seen each other at a few venues over the years, including the Mothman Festival, and that's always fun. And so we're really pleased to have you here tonight. And we're going to start out talking about your now. The Martians is your most recent book, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Well, every time you go to sleep and wake up in the morning, you might see another Nick Redfern book being promoted on Facebook. So, I've really enjoyed this book. I've always been fascinated by we've had over the years all these hints of possible structures on Mars, like the face and so forth, and the pyramids, etc. And some of these strange. Every once in a while, we would get these better high resolution photographs back of some of the other things on Mars. What was it? I know you're interested in everything, but what was it that drew you to this particular project?
Well, I guess like a lot of people, they were sort of driven to start with by the so-called face on Mars, which became sort of public domain, if you like, in the mid-1970s. And, you had these overhead photographs from NASA and showing what looked like eerily like a human type face, and possibly with sort of almost like a piece of clothing around its head, around the head itself. And people were fascinated by it, not just because of that, but also in the same area, Cydonia, that's the area of Mars, that there seemed to be what looked like, superficially, highly damaged pyramid-type structures. So, you put those two issues together, and you can see why it really opened people's eyes. Now, back then, I wasn't, back in the mid-'70s, I wasn't racing around like some precocious little kid investigating mysteries on Mars. I didn't actually sort of hear about this until, the early 1980s, mid-'80s, perhaps something like that, when I was still at school. And but when I sort of got into it, it's one of these things where something like that, you never forget it. And that was the case for me. And over the years, I sort of developed a fascination for the mysteries of Mars. And I felt, at one point, well, why don't I do a book on it? Because there's so much material of a varied kind of, well, when you look at it, it's very varied, in relation to the so-called anomalies on Mars. And I felt that now, for me at least, was the time to sort of dig into it and hopefully present a non-biased angle. That's why, some of the things that I talk about in the book, I knock down, and there's other things which I feel are genuinely weird and genuinely, eerie. And so hopefully, I've kept a good balance and presented to the reader why I personally think that there are artificial structures on Mars, and they may be, so the remnants of an ancient civilization, which is, which is a pretty sensational thing to say, but I feel there's enough data to push things down that pathway at least.
As we go on, maybe I'll ask you some of the things that you, we'll get into some of the things you think are more genuine, and then some of the things you think that may be a little bit shaky. I first heard about this on, there was a talk show host over here on weekends years ago, Jim Bohannon. I think he was the weekend guy for Larry King. And he had Richard Hoagland on one night when he had first published Monuments of Mars, The City on the Edge of Forever. And it was very compelling, very convincing, and also it the face has been debunked by a lot of people, but like you just said, when you add in what seems to be the D&M pyramid and these strange pyramidal structures, and then I remember seeing I think a photograph where they it looked like there might be some geometry involved, where they drew all the lines. And it didn't seem like if these things were just something we were imagining, it seemed like there was some kind of purpose behind it.
Well, yeah, and again, that's sort of like a perfect example of why there is this controversy. But I also think this gets a little bit sort of deep. I think, for whatever reason, it's almost, I kind of get this feeling that us, the human race, as a sort of collective body, so to speak, it's almost as if we have an affinity to Mars. You don't find a lot of people, sort of excitedly ranting about Jupiter or Saturn.
That's a good point.
Or Mercury. It's like, what's going on Mercury this week, But it's almost as if there is this, how would you describe it, kind of like an inherited memory of something, but we're not really sure what that thing might be. And I mean, if you look out throughout history, if you look at, for example, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Egypt, there was an affinity with Mars, the planet, and also, Mars, the god. And as I said, I do get a sense that, it's kind of like, you wake up in the morning with a dream and it starts to fade away and then it's gone. And I think it's kind of like that with Mars, that we've got a vague affinity to the planet, but we're not really sure why that should be the case, and maybe that is due to, some kind of connection in the distant past that, again, maybe some sort of inherited memory, but again, also something that is on the tip of your tongue and we just cannot get it.
That's a good point. There's sort of the romance of Mars and all the science fiction stories, and I don't know if you grew up reading Edgar Rice Burroughs and John Carter of Mars, but those were just very entertaining stories. You had John Carter mounting his mighty thoat, traversing the dead sea bottoms of Mars, battling the 15-foot green men. And he had quite an imagination, and I think that even some of those even actually inspired as kids some of the astronauts to start thinking outward and to look to the stars. But there's this really rich tradition in history of Mars, and from Lowell and the belief in the canals early on.
I think one thing we have to really mention, of course, is H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds.
Oh, of course, yes.
For me, that's what the Mars thing for me is. I've absolutely loved War of the Worlds, the novel, when I first read it, and of course there's been various film versions. But no, I think you're absolutely right. That idea that Mars, it's something in the psyche. It's something deep within us. I think there's a connection to that planet.
Yeah, and I think it's like when you brought up, Andy, this issue of like War of the Worlds. I think to a degree, at least, pop culture has certainly played a role, and of course, some movie makers have sort of hijacked, so to speak, the reality of the situation with, images of the face on Mars, in movies, that kind of thing. So I think, putting it visibly into the popular, so to speak, and pop culture, I think that's certainly also made people kind of sit up and listen. And I think one of the bigger reasons is because, we're often getting new material, new data on Mars in ways that we're not with other worlds. Like we're finding on Mars, new underground lakes, more and more water. There's the polar ice caps. There's all these numerous bizarre anomalies which we can talk about, and I think a lot of people are getting, whether they believe in it, sort of 100% or not. I think a lot of people do realise that, wow, there's something else about Mars, and there's something else about Mars, and that keeps going on, and becomes part of, as I said, like pop culture, but mixed with science and reality as well.
Well, even you start out the book talking about Gulliver's Travels, and why don't you talk a little bit about that? The strange, almost prophecy. I don't, it makes you wonder, and also a little bit later, I want to talk about my favorite comic book artist, Jack Kirby, and these sort of foreshadowing, these crazy coincidences. But tell us a little bit about how you open the book with the Gulliver's Travels and its connection with Mars moons.
Well, this is a really, really strange story. Like one of those stories where you could say, really, really, and it's a fascinating story, and it revolves around the classic novel Gulliver's Travels. Now, the book itself, written by Jonathan Swift, was first published in 1726, almost 300 years ago. Now, in the story itself, Jonathan Swift actually makes reference to a pair of moons that orbit the planet Mars. Now, it's important to note that Swift's novel was first published in 1726, and the work on the book had gone back to 1713. Now, you might think, well, what's so important about that or significant? Well, the fact is that, as we know, that Mars really does have two moons. They're called Deimos and Phobos. Mm-hmm. Now, what's intriguing, bear in mind, as I said, Swift was working on the book in 1713 and put Mars with 2 moons. And the difference between 1713 is the fact that the 2 Martian moons, Deimos and Phobos, were not found until 1877. So just kind of sort of ponder on that. You know, you've got Jonathan Swift talking about 2 moons orbiting Mars in 1726, and we don't even find them till 1877. And you know, there's been all sorts of theories put forward to try and understand how that might be. Now, of course, the most obvious scenario is that it would, you know, just coincidence, you know. But the fact is, if you look at the statistics and the sizes and the orbits, etc., Swift actually was not too far off in terms of the reality of the 2 moons and their orbits and etc. And you have other theories. One was the idea that a number of astronomers came to believe would be that, you know, we look at all the planets and maybe the first planet nearest the sun has 1 moon, and then the second one out has 2 moons, and the third one out has 3 moons. You know, that was one of the theories, that each planet, as it goes further and further out, each of the planets would have, you know, 1 moon, 2 moons, then 3 moons, and 4 moons, and so on. And maybe he just got it right by, you know, saying, well, you know, suggesting that there were 2 moons. And then you had the more sort of esoteric and strange theories. You know, did Swift have access to ancient archaic secrets and knew something about possibly an ancient civilization that in the distant past may actually have found the 2 moons long before our civilization did? But of course that begs the question, well, how and under what circumstances did Swift himself actually get this data? And we don't have the answers, but again, one of the fascinating things is the whole story, you know, in the book jumps straight into a sort of bona fide, bizarre mystery. And if you think about it, you just don't get that, you know, as I said, with things like Mercury or Saturn, but we keep getting it with Mars. And for it to be tied to Gulliver's Travels and Jonathan Swift, you know, it gets even more bizarre. But it gets bizarre not in a dismissive way, but from the perspective of, wow, you know, there's just another enigma and another enigma.
Yeah, it is remarkable, and I think it has to be coincidence, but just the same, we just never know.
You're not working for the government, are you?
No, good Lord, they wouldn't. If I did,
that was a joke, by the way.
I'd be like the Maxwell Smart of the CIA. You know, I wouldn't. I'd get stuck in the cone of silence and wouldn't be able to climb out.
But we do talk of meaningful coincidences, don't we, Steve? We talk about meaningful coincidences, you know, the deepest synchronicity, that kind of thing that we could be talking about more here, rather than being sort of we're dismissive. Certainly, I mean, I know you probably know that Steve and I are very much sort of John Keelian types. We are into that kind of theorising. So the idea of coincidences themselves don't necessarily mean it's dismissive coincidence. It's just that deeper coincidental times, isn't it?
Exactly. And I want to say about your book, it's very thorough, and it hits areas that I've always been fascinated by, like remote viewing. You get into that, Ingo Swann and some of the famous military remote viewers. And I want to make a mention of Mac Tonnies, who wrote a great book called After the Martian Apocalypse in a little while. But let's just before we get into the remote viewing stuff, are you familiar with a guy named Sir Charles Schultz? He used to be a guest on Coast to Coast AM years ago with Art Bell.
I don't think so, no.
I think he was primarily a futurist, but he got involved with a lot of the photographs that were coming back from Mars. And when you saw some of them, it looked like you could see trilobites and brachiopods, that kind of thing, in the soil, and it was kind of remarkable. But as usual, in any of the, like, you present a lot of anomalies in the book, and NASA just kind of keeps their mouth zipped on it. But it was just fascinating that some of the things that really, I mean, it didn't look like it was imagination. But anyway, you do get into Ingo Swann. Now, Ingo Swann was the gentleman that helped the military develop the remote viewing protocols, and he wrote a fascinating book. Now, when I give the title of the book, I always quickly give the subtitle afterwards, because otherwise people are going to think I'm talking about something else. His book is Penetration: The Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy. I did a fringe report on Mac Maloney's show with this one time, and I wouldn't tell the guys the name of the book until the very end of the report, because I knew they'd be giggling for about 5 or 10 minutes. So
you've got me giggling now.
But it's a fascinating. I mean, Nick goes through all the cloak and dagger that he went through in this ostensibly some kind of a shadowy government group, and he did some remote viewing on the moon, and I guess he also did some on Mars. My point is that in Nick's book, there's much more information that wasn't in Ingo Swann's regular book, and Nick is always doing that through, I don't know, freedom of information or his own maybe government contacts. I'm not sure. But talk a little bit about Ingo Swann and they would remote view different coordinates, and I think they went back in time, and it's mind blowing what they discovered.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is sort of like a two-part story where we know for sure that in 1984, thanks to, again, you just mentioned the Freedom of Information Act, in 1984, we know for sure that the CIA secretly remote viewed Mars. That's the one side of the story. Now, another one was in the late 1970s, and this related to as you said, to Ingo Swann. Now, Ingo Swann was one of the leading remote viewers in the United States. And for people who may not know what remote viewing, it's basically psychically using the human mind to sort of expand across the universe, and sort of see the surface of Mars, or, if you're working for the CIA, maybe trying to sort of penetrate the Kremlin, and dig through government files. But it comes down to using the human mind to perceive things in the present and the past, and some researchers think, the future as well. Now, what's interesting about all this is that Ingo Swann, as I said, late 1970s, he was already, a well-versed remote viewer, and one of the leading ones. And he was contacted by a man, Mr. Axelrod, which almost certainly was not his real name, although Axelrod is a real name. And he basically wanted Swann himself to remote view the moon, our moon. And because Swann had done, a lot of this work before, he agreed. And there was sort of a clandestine story about how he was taken to an unknown location in a helicopter, and with his eyes masked, and so nobody would know, or he wouldn't know, I should say, where they were going. And it was put to him that something weird was going on the far side of the moon. And for people who may not know, the moon itself always shows one side of the moon towards us. So, you have to sort of, we rely on images, for the pictures on the far side of the moon. And when Swann actually did the remote viewing project, he said that he could see what looked like buildings, structures, and a significant degree of building, or like mega scale, buildings, things like this. And this, it seemed like at least, that this is what Axelrod was looking for. And it all actually tied in with a guy named George Leonard, who wrote a book about mysteries on the moon. And Axelrod had clearly got a copy of that book, and that probably, to some degree, inspired him to bring in Swan. Now, Ingo Swan said that while he was on, or when he was remote viewing the moon, he saw these underground structures, massive underground structures, but on top of that, he also saw these bizarrely totally naked humans, and some of them were described as being incredibly tall, looking like us, but sort of 10 to 12 feet tall. Now, that in itself is interesting. The story gets creepy because the more that Swan began to remote view these entities deep under the surface of the moon, he began to realize that they were able to sense when he was probing their minds. And he sort of became very frightened, literally frightened about this, the idea that, he was watching them and they realized and they started to watch him. And so to a degree, he backed away. But the interesting thing is the fact he talked about seeing these extremely tall human-like entities. Now, this sort of leaps into the 1984 CIA remote viewing sessions of Mars, excuse me, because the remote viewers who ran this program for Mars, one of the things they came back with was that on Mars there were these extremely tall but extremely similar to us humanoids on the surface of Mars. Now, to get to sort of the heart of the CIA story, it was May the 22nd, 1984, when the first CIA secret remote viewing of Mars began. Now, it's intriguing that the CIA even remote viewed Mars in the first place. It's not like if you work for the CIA, you don't go to work every day and say, oh, I think I'm going to remote view Mars and see what happened there a million years ago.
Right.
You don't just do that out of the blue. So my view, or my suspicion, is that prior to the May 22 readings of Mars, there had to have been something that came before that prompted the CIA to do that. And as I said, you don't just do it out of the blue. Now, if you read the first of what we know now is 9 actual remote viewings of Mars by the CIA. The only one that's in the public domain so far is the first one. Now, that talks about Mars in a state of near destruction. The remote viewer talked about how the sky seemed to be on fire, there was massive earthquakes, these very humanoid-type entities were fleeing for these gigantic underground bunkers, and it was kind of like, sort of Armageddon, but on Mars rather than on Earth. And literally, your sort of world's worst sort of disaster movie, that kind of thing. But everything came down to the idea that the Martians possibly, or at least some of them, may have fled to the Earth. And, of course, then it gets even more controversial. But, as I said, I think the most important thing to note about this, and this is very quick, one of the most important things is that that NASA were actually out of the loop of the 1984 sessions that the CIA
Oh,
ran.
really?
Yeah. Now, this is the important thing because, whichever side of the coin you're on in relation to these, Mars mysteries, etc., the fact is that everybody, agrees that NASA is the primary agency within the US that handles, space travel and space exploration. But the CIA program in 1984, that was not revealed until until the early 2000s. So we're talking about 18 years after this happened, and nobody knew about this, and not even NASA. So when people say, NASA is at the heart of research into Mars, well, that is true. But if you look at the alternative side, like the remote viewing, then you've got other agencies looking at Mars in a very different way to, the way that NASA would have done it. So, we cannot say for sure that there's just one agency examining and exploring Mars. There clearly isn't. We know at least of two, and Axelrod, because his program was semi-connected with Mars as well. That's three potential different programs, which may have been interconnected, but there were certainly three different projects. Maybe they were under like an umbrella, but there were certainly three of them.
And by the way, Ingo Swann's book, it has so much more to it. It's so creepy, the things that he went through. And I knew I was friends with Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who knew him. And she and all the military remote viewers, they've all said how credible he is. He's the kind of guy that not only very talented, a psychic and remote viewer, but I guess he just had a stellar reputation. So people should keep that in mind when they read the really wild account. Now, I read about the remote viewing Mars in the past and the destruction, the implication being that perhaps a comet close passed by a comet or some astronomical calamity struck Mars. But I think I read it in one of Joe McMonagle's books. But in your book, you say that Joe McMonagle said that he was not the remote viewer that picked up this material.
Well, I did say that, and I think that's correct. But there is also the fact that we know that there were multiple CIA.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. So this is, and the people we're talking to, we're sort of talking about something that occurred in 1984, and, they're reflecting back sort of 15, 16 years later. So I think where the confusion comes in is a lot of people don't realize that there was actually more than one program, on the part of the CIA. The only difference is the other ones haven't been declassified yet. So that's why I think we have the confusion. People, because we've just got files on the one remote viewing program, people assume that was the only one that was put into place, but it wasn't. So, that kind of, I think, one person is talking about one of the programs, somebody else may be talking about another one, and they're getting confused and mixed, as to which one they're actually talking about,
Didn't one of them also pick a sense that they had tried to find another place to live during this catastrophe, and they went to a planet, I'm going to assume Earth, maybe Venus, I don't know, where the terrain was full of volcanoes and quite inhabitable.
Yeah, this is another fascinating aspect of the story. The idea that these sort of Martians, realizing that, their world was really kind of spiraling into destruction, fled to the Earth. And some of the stories suggest that they knew that this was going to happen and had sort of made plans, which suggests that it possibly was not something like, the equivalent of a nuclear war on here, which would be, everything would be over in a few minutes. We're not talking about that. It seems like maybe they had pre-warnings of possibly like, ecological event, or who knows, sort of giant asteroid strike, something like that. But it was enough time for some of them to flee. And one of the parts of the story is that like an armada, if you like, made it from Mars to the Earth. Now, if that is the case and they could survive, that would suggest that the atmosphere and possibly things like the pressure on Earth, must have been relatively similar And of course, from there, the story goes on from there, where the people on Earth at that time perceived the sort of armada of Martians as gods, and maybe even the Martians thought, well, that's not a bad thing, and then presented themselves as gods, so to speak. Now, of course, whenever you sort of question, orchestrated and religion, and you start talking about, well, there weren't really gods or a god, they're actually aliens, that always causes an uproar. And I sometimes wonder, and I do talk about this in the book, about maybe somebody in government thinks or knows or suspects maybe something like that was the scenario, but they obviously don't know how to tell anyone. So what do? They hide it because they don't know what to do with it. That's a classic scenario. It's sort of like the person who wakes up one morning with a lump under their arm or something, and they ignore it because they don't want to deal with it, and it goes on and on. I can kind of see a scenario like that where we're not being told because nobody really knows how to tell it without causing mayhem, really.
One thing, and then I'll turn it over to Andy. It seems like Ingo Swann was certain in his remote viewing that these very tall people that he was seeing on the moon, working on various machinery and so forth, were in fact Martians.
Well, yeah, that was one of the theories. That's one of the theories, but what he was perceiving, and and that sort of again was another part of this. And what is interesting is if you look at the time frame, I've not found anything pre-77 or 76, I should say, that relates to the remote viewing and psychically spying on the moon and on Mars. So I think something happened around that period. Now, I mentioned George Leonard's book, Somebody on Our Moon, and he was writing that in 76. And Axelrod, we know for sure, 100% sure, we know that because he mentioned this with Swann, that Axelrod was very intrigued but also concerned by what George Leonard had found on the surface of the moon. And that was 76. The book came out not long after, 77. And then we know that some of the work with Swann continued through 1978. Then in the early 80s, we've got the CIA. So something between late 70s through the early 80s, somebody had found something to the extent that there were, as I said, at least 3 operations and then these multiple CIA ones. So, in other words, I don't know what they found or what prompted them, but something prompted the remote viewing guys and women in those programs. Somebody gave them the go-ahead to focus on the moon and focus on Mars, and also look to see if there's a connection between the two as well.
Axelrod seemed to be very overwhelmed by the whole thing. I mean, he's the guy sort of in charge. Ingo Swann had no idea what he's getting into, but it seemed like Axelrod was kind of freaked out by what was going on, and just we think that the government knows everything about ETs and UFOs or whatever, when they probably, and Andy and I were talking about this a little earlier, they probably don't know crap, but they're not going to tell the American people or the world that they don't know what's going on, and they're powerless to do anything about it. But I read Leonard's book when it first came out back in the 70s, and I wondered at the time if it was legitimate, and because the things that he was seeing in these photographs, and now what Swann and Axelrod are talking about, it seems like some of his findings were legitimate. And this would have been back before. There's a lot of talk, Nick, about how they have doctored these photographs from the moon, blocking out anomalies and so forth. Supposedly people have been caught doing that. And but back then, Leonard would get these pristine photographs from NASA and be able to examine them. So perhaps he really was finding stuff that was anomalous.
Well, yeah, and I think, there's clearly more to that story. When you've got all those snippets and they all come together, that's like a classic situation where something was going on, something big was going on. And, the idea that there could have been surviving Martians, that made it to the Earth, made it to the moon, and were meddling on the other side of the moon, where for the most part, most people aren't going to see anything because it's the far side of the moon. It does create a very sinister picture.
It does.
And I mean, and then you add that the gods angle, and people ask me, well, why don't they just tell us if there was something there 100,000 years ago, a civilization? Why not tell us? And the only thing I can think of is that it would be something that still impacts our world today. If it was just that we really did find, ruined pyramids and a ruined carved face and some weird little animals, I don't really think NASA would, or any agency, would hide it. I mean, what's the big deal in hiding the fact you found a little animal the size of a rat? That's not going to affect U.S. national security or anything like that. I do think that if it could have an impact on civilization, then that would be a reason. And the biggest reason in relation to civilization would be religion, I think.
I think also it's a kind of a default position with most governments to automatically hide anything they don't fully understand or can't fully make use of or make sense of, rather than say, well, here's the information we have. What do you think, guys? It's always a case of, no, we're going to control the story until we know what it is. And if we don't know what it is, we're not going to give you the story. We'll hold on to it. But again, I think you're right there, Nick, the idea that it would impact upon people's religions and faith. And if you're showing that these ancient visitors, we have now called them as gods, but they're actually the Martians that survived, that would have a strong impact around the world. And I could see that would be potentially a reason why they would certainly sit on this kind of information for fear of the effect it would have.
Well, yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I was going to essentially agree, which is a good thing. And I think somebody knows more than most of us do. And I think most people in NASA are completely out the loop. If something was found, if it was sort of definitive photos, and let's say of something that was clearly, a structure, I was going to say man-made, but Martian-made, So if we found something like that and a group of 15 or so were the only people who knew, and there was no artifacts, nothing was brought back, but it was just really life-changing pictures, that could quite easily be hidden, because all you've got to do is hide a bunch of photographs, in a vault somewhere and just lock it. That would be easy. And so for that reason, I think most people are out of the loop. Now, people say, well, isn't NASA just hiding everything? Well, they're not, because, the whole reason why we have pictures of the face on Mars and the pyramids and a lot of these other structures as well, the only reason we've got these pictures is because NASA freely put them out there. It isn't like we had to use the Freedom of Information Act to push NASA to reveal them, but NASA put all those images out there. So you have the theory that perhaps NASA just doesn't care. They really do think these images that it really is just pareidolia, But on the other hand, you have the theory that some people suspect that maybe NASA might be kind of part of a disclosure kind of situation, where a bit by bit, well, let's put a few more pictures out for them to see, and then we'll put some more pictures for them to see. And by the time another 5 years comes around, we're all sort of acclimatized to the idea that, yes, there is life on Mars, rather than shove it in our faces and, you know, and having 2,000 heart attacks across every city or whatever, you know.
And I want to remind everybody that you are listening to The High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I am Steve Ward. My co-host today is Andy Mercer, and we are talking to Nick Redfern about his latest book called The Martians. Before we get back to Mars, Nick, I just wanted to ask you, one of my favorite books of yours is Three Men Seeking Monsters. My wife's favorite book, also by you, and I think Linda Godfrey, even the Linda Godfrey, said that's one of her favorite books. Is that still in print? I mean, if somebody buys it, will you make a royalty on it?
Oh no, not now.
Bummer.
Yeah, well, what happens basically with a lot of my, well, not a lot of my books, but on some of my books, you know, the publisher will put the books out there, you know, when they first come out, and we're doing what we're doing now, you know, promoting a new book. Excuse me. But after, you know, sort of with my books, it's really dependent on the sales. Now, some of my books, you know, are still in print. My third book is still in print, and that came out in 1999. So, you know, that's sort of 21 years ago.
Is that Strange Secrets?
No, that was called Cosmic Crashes.
The
UFO book. And now that's still available, and it's still in print, but it's a very small print. You know, they might sort of, you know, put a new printing every 3, 4, 5 years. But most of them, you know, they stay, their lifespan, so to speak, is probably maybe sort of 6, 7, 8 years, and then they won't withdraw the books, obviously, but they won't publish any more. So, you know, let's say hypothetically, you know, one book had a print run of 5,000 copies, but only sold immediately like 2,000. That 3,000 that's left would still be in Amazon and on maybe the shelves of Barnes and Noble and things like that. And so that's basically how it works. But no, that one actually isn't. You can get it. You can get new copies because they haven't all been sold. But it's actually not still in print now. No. Neither
so you don't make any.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to direct my audience that they have to buy that book, but to make up for the fact that Nick isn't going to make a royalty on it, you're going to have to buy the last 6 new books by Nick so that he, you know, can keep the heat on this winter.
That's
okay.
Right, yeah.
It is. It's a really. Yeah. It's not just a fun and entertaining book. It's very thoughtful, and people that, like Andy mentioned, get into the sort of the Keel-esque or the Carl Jung or the aspect of the paranormal, the paraphysical. It really it's just a really great book.
Oh well, thanks. And it looks at the angles, you know, of. If we sort of believe in monsters, you know, they'll come to life. Sort of the thought form tulpa kind of situation, and then these things, you know, when they've been sort of brought into reality, you know, the last thing what they want to do is to be destroyed and decomposed, you know, and destroyed. That's one of the theories that is quite an interesting theory for a lot of phenomena. I'm quite interested in the whole thought form tulpa angle, and I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Slender Man Mystery, which was a look at how, you know, the Slender Man started off as this meme, you know, that just went out of control, wildly out of control. But then after about 8 or 9 months, people swore they saw the Slender Man in the real world. This was after thousands and thousands of kids were obsessing on the Slender Man and focusing on it, and there was YouTube shows coming out and things like this. And then suddenly, after this huge following, people said they'd seen the Slender Man, as if, you know, all this intense focus had created inadvertently a thought form version of the original, totally fictional Slender Man. So that's kind of a lot of what's sort of at the heart of that particular book.
It's interesting you should mention that, actually, because going a bit of full circle, and one of the things about Mars I thought was interesting was the Martian Chronicles, Ray Bradbury's book, and the TV series. I saw that when I was fairly young at the time, and one thing that stuck in my mind was the scene in which the guy's trying to set up the first church on Mars, and this sort of figure walks into the back of the church. The vicar turns around and effectively turns him into Jesus, literally turns him into Jesus, and the entity explains that, well, in a nutshell, is I take on the form you give me. You know, we're amorphous. There isn't a particular identity. We just form the one that you give me by your belief system. And it kind of fits with the Slender Man idea, because that notion that we've somehow generated the Slender Man, brought it into reality almost because of so many people interested in and believing they've seen it and photographed it, etc. So it kind of ties in together with that. And I'm, personally speaking, very much a believer that this stuff is amorphous completely, and things identify according to our belief system. So I must admit, Nick, I've not read that particular book, but yeah, I must get hold of it, definitely.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, I can actually get copies from the publisher, and I know what it's like as like a fellow author, you know, we're all sort of, you know, we're not always sort of, you know, running around in Ferraris or whatever, you know. But what I'll do, don't worry, if you want to, either you or Steve, you know, give me your mailing address, I'll get the publisher to send you a copy. You don't need to, you know, they'll be happy to send it, because it's always good for publicity, and there's no sense you having, you know, to sort of have to pay for, you know, really transatlantic copy of the book and whatever. So
we'll definitely get Andy's address. I probably have them all. In fact, I came across, I had bought one of your books, I think it was Black Diary, a couple times. Sometimes, I hate to admit this, people, but I'm a little bit disorganized, and sometimes I can't find a damn book. So I'll get on Amazon, tap, 2 days later, I get it. And then eventually I find it. But then friends of mine that are interested in the books, they are the recipient of my absent-mindedness, my disorganized demeanor. Yeah, Andy was talking earlier about, you know, how the heck does he write that many books? And so I think I joked with Nick once that I was going to find one of his older books that he'd forgotten about, and I suggested Cosmic Crashes, but he just mentioned that, so he remembers it. So I was going to take it, change the title, you know, punch it up a little bit with sex and violence, and then kind of resell it, you know, under what do they have, those special print on demand houses or whatever, but I guess that won't work. The other thing I wanted to mention, I want to get into some of the weird structures now, some of the weird anomalies on Mars. But another book, I just mentioned, Black Diary, kind of connects with this a little bit, and that I think to sum it up, doesn't that cover situations where people have had experiences simply by reading some, you know, your books. I think you said one time, Nick, that you would get like static or maybe get disconnected on the internet when you were talking about things like the Men in Black or the Black-Eyed Children. And I know David Weatherly, who's written a book on Black-Eyed Children, people have had all kinds of bizarre things happen when they're reading his book.
Yeah, well, the Black Diary is sort of written in it's called the Black Diary because it really is kind of a diary of about 3 years of weirdness and me investigating primarily issues related to the Men in Black mystery. Now, when I talk about the Men in Black, you know, I'm not talking about the, you know, sort of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. You know, that's Hollywood's version of the Men in Black. But if you go back to the early 50s when the whole MIB mystery really began, nearly all of the witnesses to the MIB described them as being extremely pale and skinny with these bulging eyes, and they don't even look fully human. And they still wear these old-style suits and old fedora-type hats. And they seem far more paranormal than, you know, that they've stepped out of the Pentagon, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I've actually done 3 books on the Men in Black, one on the Women in Black and the Black Diary. And the whole phenomenon is a weird one. And you're right that I've found a number of people who were sort of delving into books on things like the Black-Eyed Children and the Men in Black and Women in Black. They started to get experiences and paranormal experiences when they started to read books on those subjects. A friend of mine, Buffy Clary, and people always ask, is that really her real name Buffy. It actually is. It's not something inspired by Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But Buffy, she borrowed a book of mine on the jinn, and I swear I'm not making this up. On 2 occasions, while she was reading the book and researching it, she was hit by lightning. Once in her house and one outside. And then there was a third time, I think it was 2017, when she was in a hammock outside in her backyard, where there was a lightning strike of the tree next to her, and it didn't hit her, but it was close enough where she felt really ill, and she felt, like her fingers were vibrating, and she had like pins and needles, and she went to the hospital just to be safe. But she was struck by lightning effectively 3 times in about 4 years, and on 2 occasions, while she was actually reading that book, or at least researching the material that was in the book.
I was going to say, if you think about it, that's exactly how magic's supposed to work. You carry invocations and rituals to engender something, create the energy. So effectively, that's exactly what you're doing. If you're really delving into these topics and reading in great detail, you are visualizing, you're creating. So yeah, I mean, that whole type of thing comes back to that, doesn't it? This essentially, you could be basically generating these things. And as I was saying before, I certainly feel there's something pre-existing that's like clay, if you like, that could be molded into these forms. So it's not even as if you're creating out of scratch. You're giving some energy form somewhere, identity that is then taken on. And the idea particularly that after a while we lose interest in these things, but they don't go, they just sort of fade a bit but are still around, again, which makes certain sense for some of the things that are still being seen, that people still see things like fairies and goblins, those kind of things, where perhaps they exist because they've been believed in for such a long time. And even though belief may have faded, they haven't faded. They still linger.
And that's very similar to the whole UFO phenomenon, because back in the 1800s, when there was a wave in the latter part of the 1800s, people were seeing UFOs, but they weren't like flying saucers or anything spectacular. They were more like huge balloons, kind of like the huge Zeppelin balloons that the Germans used in the First World War. Then in the Second World War, we had these small balls of light that would chase both Allied and Axis pilots that became known as the Foo Fighters, and that's where the band actually got their name from. These Foo Fighters were these strange balls of light that were seen in the Second World War. Then in 1946, we had what were called the ghost rockets, then flying saucers, and then back in the 1990s, you had the rise of what were called the flying triangles. So in other words, the phenomenon essentially changes its appearance according to the technology and the culture of the era. If you think about it, we hardly ever get reports today of literal flying saucers. Flying saucers went out, and they were replaced largely by the flying triangles. So again, I think there's something to the idea that subconsciously the reason why the UFO phenomenon has changed. When I say changed, I mean by when you look at these craft, they've changed so much over the decades. It makes me think that subconsciously we are sort of upgrading the UFOs themselves, because our civilization is sort of doing exactly the same thing, and that's why we don't see those old balloons type UFOs from the 1800s. We don't see the Foo Fighters. We don't often see flying saucers. And I think part of it, at least, is us projecting how we think they should be for the relevant era, albeit subconsciously.
Yeah, and they always seem to stay ahead of the technology of the time. They're always a little bit ahead, but they also carry with them so many strange features, high strangeness. Like even the airships, people would see ape-like creatures and large black cats on the ground, sort of like we sometimes see Bigfoot in conjunction with various craft and so forth. What I was going to say, Nick, is that you're going to have to become more responsible and start putting Surgeon General warnings on your books. May get struck by lightning, may fry your transistors or whatever, so that people can become prepared. Okay, now you mentioned one of the fascinating parts of your book, and we won't be able to get to too many of these, but are the really bizarre anomalies, the structures on Mars. Before we get to the structures, there is one photograph. By the way, I think it's some years ago. I think NASA was actually holding back some of these, and if my memory serves me correctly, Senator John McCain rattled their tree a little bit and said, "Look, you've got to release more of these photographs." And that's when we got the strange. I don't know, translucent snake-like images that people, some say are water channels or whatever, and the trees, the photograph of what looked like trees from the air is just, for some reason, it's just very eerie. Can you talk a little bit about some of those structures? Again, there's a debate. You knew Mac Tonnies, didn't you?
Yeah, Mac was a good friend of mine, and as you said earlier, he wrote a really good book called After the Martian Apocalypse, and that was, Mac was someone who himself, had a deep interest in the Martian anomalies and these stories of ancient civilizations, and it's a really cool book. It's a sort of really well written book, and and well presented, in terms of when you're addressing, something that's so controversial. So it's a really good book, and he was someone who, recognized that these anomalies didn't seem to be, just kind of somebody seeing Elvis's face in a cup of coffee or whatever,
Right.
And the more, you look into these anomalies, some of them do seem legitimately weird. Now, you mentioned trees. This goes back to the 1990s when on some of NASA's pictures, now we're not talking about pictures that came from the rovers going across the landscape, we're talking about one of NASA's orbital craft. And it actually took a number of pictures of what look eerily like bushes and trees on the surface of Mars. Now, granted, they look very different to the trees and bushes on Earth, which you would expect, it's a different planet. But if you look at them, it kind of looks like, when you see the pictures, it looks like somebody took a picture out of an aircraft window, flying over the Arizona desert and focusing on a tree, a solitary tree on its own. And that kind of is how it looks. And it's difficult to dismiss it as think other than what it looks like. Now, if you Googled Mars photo banyan tree, B-A-N-Y-A-N, you'll see a number of the pictures and how they really do look like trees. Now, the other one you talk about, the Martian tubes. Well, these tubes on the surface of Mars, nobody knows really what they are. But again, we've got aerial pictures of them, and they seem to be long, clear tubes that run across certain portions of Mars. And Mac Tonnies speculated on the possibility that perhaps in the distant past, maybe they were the equivalent of something like, the New York subway and the London Underground, things like that. In other words, as means to travel across the planet. And it really is difficult, to explain what they are. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know, and I was a bit surprised by this, even within the community that looks into this, but everybody's heard of the face on Mars, but there's actually another one that's become known as the crowned face. Now, this is a really interesting story. The area is called the Libya Monte, and there's a couple of pictures that were taken aerially from the Mars Global Surveyor, and it shows a photograph of what looks incredibly like a face. Now, what you have on there is what looks like a helmet or a crown, which hence the term of the title, and you also have two eyes, which actually looks like there's a pupil in each one. There's a nose between, and there's even two nostrils.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a bloody nose with two nostrils. I mean, how does that happen by chance?
Yeah, and then you've got the lip, chin, and it almost looks like it's got a dimpled chin as well, which is really strange. Now, again, if you Google crowned hair, the crowned face. If you Google crowned face Mars photo, you'll see this, and I really find that one far more so than the face on Mars difficult to dismiss it. Now, kind of getting away from the faces, but also keeping on the issue of strange photos, there's a story that surfaced actually less than a decade ago. It's become known as the face hugger photo. And it's called the face hugger because it shows a picture of something that looks just like the face hugger in the Alien movies starring Sigourney Weaver. You know, these sort of spidery, fast-running creatures that grab you around the face, you know. And then,
it's sort of that crab thing that you can't tell if it's you almost wonder if it's three-dimensional.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, again, if you Google NASA photo, face hugger photo, you'll see a picture of something very strange, which it looks like it's crawling up the side of a cave. The picture that I've got is sort of is cut down, but we know that whatever it is, it's on the face of a cave. Now, it looks like something with a circular body with what looks like 8 limbs, and it kind of looks like a combination of a crab and a spider. We don't know the size. Now, whether it's alive or it's not, it's difficult to explain it's off as a rock because it doesn't look like anything like a rock at all. But if you were to ask me, do I think it looks like some sort of really creepy, weird, spidery thing? Well, I actually think it does look like a really weird, creepy, spidery thing crawling up a cave.
Certainly, I'm looking at it now. The thing itself is a slightly different colour to all the rocks around it. So if it's a rock outcrop, it doesn't really make any sense because the colouring is different. I mean, again, I'm not saying it's a living creature or even a fossilised creature, but it certainly does look strange.
It's some of these things you look at and you think it goes a little bit beyond one's imagination. But we really don't know. Nick, would you talk a little bit about there's two sort of monoliths you deal with. There's one that's on one of the moons of Mars that I think Buzz Aldrin referred to, but there's also one on Mars that if I don't have them mixed up, that looks like the opening monolith in 2001.
No, you're not wrong. There's on Mars and also on Phobos. There is like a monolith on both of them. Now, again, it's difficult to rationalize this with just something created by nature. And again, if you Google NASA Mars monoliths and also Phobos monoliths, you'll see these aerial images of what look just like monoliths, like tombstones, and they're just standing there upright from the surface. And you can also see the shadow, sort of showing a line. Clearly it's, it is some sort of monolith type thing. And again, it's very difficult to understand how Mother Nature could actually create something along those lines. It's nothing like your average stone, rock, boulder. It looks like a carved, or both of them look like carved monoliths. And, we even had, major media coverage, like, for example, John Glenn, one of the first astronauts, he felt that this was well worth looking at, and actually was quite vocal about it because, like most people, he realized this was not, your average your average stone, your average rocks. So, in that sense, you have to wonder if which one thing to talk about, sort of civilization, ancient civilizations on Mars, and these anomalies and these carved faces and heads and crab-like creatures, but then to find also, just very close to Mars itself, the moons, I should stress, are not at all very far away from the planet itself, but to find maybe, it isn't just life on Mars, but that the fact that there are these monolith-type structures on Phobos, that makes me wonder if at some point, the Martians, or, it could be perceived as evidence that the Martians actually did manage to achieve spaceflight. They left Mars and were able to, at the very least, travel to Phobos and leave something behind, as an image, so to speak. And that would also suggest, well, if they could get to Phobos, maybe they could get to the Earth as well.
But there's so much. I mean, there's I think a sort of a profile that is reminiscent of Nefertiti. There's something that looks like it could be a sphinx in the distance, and even a drawing or image of Anubis, perhaps. Did you want to comment on any of those?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Nefertiti story is really interesting one. If you look at Egyptian images of Nefertiti, they're always sort of side on. That's how the the Egyptians did their artwork, as you can see from the famous pyramids. And Nefertiti is always portrayed with this sort of large, tall helmet / hat on, and very clearly feminine. And if you look at this one particular part of Mars, there is what looks like a side-on image of Nefertiti. And I've shown the pictures to some people, and prior to showing it to them, people have just sort of scoffed. But if you look at the picture, it really does look at it. And if you look at the high-res online version, you'll see, and again, Google Nefertiti Mars. That's really all you need to do, and you'll see it. And you see the classic Egyptian headgear, the nose, eye, lips, chin, neck, and it's difficult again to say this is just coincidence. Now, one of the things that a lot of people have overlooked, and I felt it was an important thing because it relates to all this, is, a lot of people have said, like I said earlier, this is like just seeing a face of Elvis in a cup of coffee or something like that.
That happens to me all the time.
Yeah. But my argument is, if this is all just down to seeing, like, next door's dog's face in the clouds, why is it that all of these anomalies, which are dismissed by NASA, why is it that they all seem to resemble Egyptian architecture? In other words, we don't see sort of pareidolia in relation to looking like ancient Greek architecture or ancient Rome architecture. Why is it that these anomalies, whether you believe in them or not, that why is it that they all seem to resemble ancient Egyptian architecture? And that's one of the things I think is important. It's why, believe it or don't believe in what they show, why is it always looking like it's Egyptian? Why shouldn't it be more, varied?
And that's an important part of your book. You do make early on, you make the possible connection between Egypt and Mars. And even you go back in time when certain things have crashed into the earth and broken open. Supposedly, I mean, even I think the New York Times carried a story about something that they broke open, that there seemed to be some strange lettering in there that they were suggesting were hieroglyphics.
Well, yeah, and this is sort of, again, like another classic example, of what we're seeing. And if you look, all these images, you've got pyramids, you've got sphinx-like faces, you've got one that looks like Nefertiti, I would be more inclined to, to say, yeah, okay, this is just, tricks of the eye. But as I said, when so much of it appears Egyptian, to me, that's beyond just coincidence. And, and the more you look at it and the more you look at the anomalies, there is that connection. And maybe that's why we have that affinity. Maybe there was some sort of ancient Martian connection to, the whole angle of the Egyptians. And I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is about how Robert Schoch, made a very good case that the Sphinx was actually not built by, the Egyptians. It was built by, an even earlier civilization. So, if we could sort of solve that issue completely, maybe we would find, an even older story to be unveiled.
That there's so much we don't know. And in the book, you also talk about we actually have the technology, I guess, the satellites going around Mars to really focus down to some really, really tiny areas. And you have to wonder how much stuff, how many photographs, what do they have that might be really mind blowing that they're not showing us?
Well, I mean, the ones that we've got, that we've got for sure, they're fascinating enough. Now,
right.
Whether or not there is a definitive smoking gun, I mean, for me, I would almost say the facehugger was close to that. But
yeah.
But I mean, just a few years ago, we had the surfacing of another picture that became known as Mars Henge, sort of like a play on Stonehenge. And if you look at this aerial picture, it shows these sort of large stones in like a circular situation, and then a lot of smaller ones which are also sort of circling around the bigger ones, and it kind of looks a little bit like Stonehenge, and that had sort of a flurry of media coverage when that particular story surfaced. So theoretically speaking, maybe there really are other pictures that are so clear and accurate that there really is just no way to deny it. But like I said, I mean, unfortunately from our perspective, hiding just a few hundred even, or a couple of few thousands would not be a problem. We're not talking about having captured a 300-foot long Martian battleship. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about something you could hide in sort of a briefcase and no one would ever know. But I mean, one of the other ones, I don't know if you've got your copy of the book with you, Steve, but
yeah.
If you look at page 131, there's a photograph which I reproduced there, which is, it's called the Twin Peaks area because it has these twin peaks,
right.
Heaps. And if you look at one of them, below it, we know that there's a large something beneath this superficial pyramid. And if you look at it, it kind of does look like a sort of side-on image of the Sphinx. You've got like the body stretched out, the head, and then you've got like the paws stretching out at the front. I'm not saying for sure that's what it is, but if you look at that, and then you look at a picture of the Sphinx, and then you sort of realize that behind it is like a pyramid type structure, you have to wonder, is that all just coincidence? I mean, like I said, I'm not saying for sure that's what it is. I can never say that. I'm not been to Mars, but it does kind of look Sphinx-like,
It definitely does. Yeah, you got it, Andy?
I've just found it. Yes.
Okay, right. Yeah, it's and when you look at some of these things, Nick, you talk about this possible connection or something in the, I don't know, the racial memory or whatever, but you look at some of these areas on Mars, whether it's terrain or some of the alleged structures, and it does stir something inside you. I mean, it does trigger something.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I kind of view it like, this is sort of dumbing it down a little bit, but I think it's kind of like something your pet dog, you know, when it goes to bed at night, it sort of circles around and then lays down after 30 seconds or so, because that's sort of like an inherited memory of when they lived in the wild, you know, and they're laying down their patch to go to sleep at night in the jungle or the woods. That's exactly what they're doing. And so maybe, you know, there's more to inherited memory than we realize, that it's not just, wow, this is a cool thing about Mars. Maybe it's far more than that. It's something that impacts on us and impacts on them, whatever they really were, you know.
Yeah, and to carry that further, if people want to be freaked out a little bit and entertained, get a hold of the movie Quatermass and the Pit, because it kind of pulls together everything we've just been talking about with the racial memory. Yeah.
Yeah. And you often find that, though, you know, like sci-fi kind of comes before reality, or it kind of blends into the two. I mean, I talk about that in the book with, for example, the famous comic book artist and writer Jack Kirby. Back in the 1950s, you know, long before he was doing sort of superhero comic books, he was doing sci-fi comic books. And one of the stories is actually called The Face on Mars. And in the story, what you've actually got is this gigantic carved face on Mars. And one of the astronauts manages to climb it and gets inside it via the eye sockets, the carved eye sockets. And the astronaut, the key character in it, he gets this image in his mind of like a huge sort of battle between different organizations, different groups. And, you know, people have wondered, is it just a coincidence that that Jack Kirby, you know, came out with this story, the face on Mars, and, you know, it's this gigantic, huge carved face, you know, out of stone, out of rock. And on top of that, you know, then suddenly 20 years later, in the mid-70s, there really is a face on Mars.
I know.
And is that just coincidence, or, you know, was Kirby kind of almost like downloading data and not necessarily realizing it, but assuming that this was just a cool story? Maybe it wasn't just that. Maybe this is one of these flashes into the past, you know, something like that.
Well, people have said that Jules Verne did the same thing. He wrote a book, I don't remember the title, but it was about Paris in the future. And he's talking about even things like fax machines. And of course, we all know the Nautilus was powered by, and all the things that he did kind of foresee in a way. So there may be something to that. But you know, Jonathan Swift to Jack Kirby, it's really bizarre.
Yeah. But that's also what makes the thing so sort of I would say sort of enduring. You know, it never goes away. But it also is something that really kind of reels us in, because, you know, there really is something to think about. Again, whether you people buy into these, you know, bizarre stories and, you know, the photos and the CIA, you know, remote viewing, whether you think there's validity to doing all this and coming with these different, you know, sort of conclusions about this or that, the fact is, it is all there to be seen, and there is a huge amount of bizarre phenomena on Mars, whether you like it or not. You know, it's there. It's just how you interpret it. That's the big thing. And I think a lot of that debate will go on until we have the day comes when we are able to go to Mars, and in a way where, you know, it's not going to take 4 years each way, and the astronauts come back totally crazy because they've just gone crazy. You know, I mean, if you look at the situation now, people are sort of, you know, all across the planet, you know, suffering for stress and, you know, all sorts of situations, and they're at home as well. You know, I mean, imagine what it would be like for say 5 astronauts going to Mars, even if it was a fairly large craft, I could easily see how, sort of psychological issues could come in, and possibly irreversible. And, then you've got to make the journey back. I'm not sure if we are at the point, even never mind the technology, but the effects on the astronauts themselves. I don't think, necessarily enough has gone into that angle. But what I would say is that if you sort of look at all that, I think the only way we are going to get the answers, as I said, is if we can get there and spend significant time there and actually say, let's go and see the face, once and for all. Or actually, could they go back to that area where that cave and the face hugger was? And if it's still there and it is a rock, well, it's a rock. But it's more intriguing if they do actually go to that area and that thing is not there anymore. That would be the big irony. Would be you could say you've proved it by the fact that there's nothing there, but you have proved it, kind of thing,
Well, I know in Arizona they check their shoes sometimes before they put them on to see if a scorpion's in there. So that's probably what they'd have to do to make sure one of those little huggers isn't in their boots.
Come home.
I finally was able to get a hold of that Jack Kirby story. I've got a couple really nice hardbound volumes of some of his artwork. I was a fan of Jack Kirby from the monster and science fiction comics all the way to the superhero wave of the 60s. So that's just fascinating stuff. I think we'll kind of start to wrap it up here. But first, I want to know if Nick, if you want to get anything else in. And before I say that, ladies and gentlemen, you've got to pick up the book. I mean, we've just scratched the surface. It's fascinating from cover to cover. And Andy, if you want to get anything else in here, please feel free.
I think we covered.
It did pretty good, I think. Yeah,
covered a lot.
I mean, you even deal with the what it would take to move some of these structures around. So I mean, it's very thorough. But I think they'll really find the remote viewing section fascinating, and the in-depth discussion you give on these different structures. These anomalies around Mars. So
yeah, and I think it's important, that all of these anomalies, or you want to term them, are all on Mars. They were scattered around the whole solar system. That's one thing. But for me, when you see them, Mars isn't that big, and yet you're seeing them all over the place. We know we've got a significant, huge amount of water on the polar ice caps, and we also know now that there's a significant amount of regular water on Mars. Actually, several underground lakes were found filled with water, and then you've also got water in the form of vapor on Mars as well. And so, when you've got water and what looks like bushes and trees, you're well on your way to, some degree of possibly life. Now, it would still be amazing if the only life we found was, let's say 15 or 16 little beetles or something like that, little grubs running around. That would still be amazing, because we would have found a literal alien. Not perhaps the alien we were looking for, but it would still be an alien. And so I think all of this together, it presents like a huge panoramic story. But it also demonstrates our ignorance of, I think, some of the key issues in our history that we've forgotten or lost. Probably that's a better way to put it, Or in some cases, if there are people who don't want to tell us about it, something that's been deliberately hidden. And kind of like on the final stage of the book, I talk about the parallels between that and the original Planet of the Apes film in 1968, when you have the science expert, Dr. Zayas. He deliberately destroys any evidence of an advanced man in the distant past, because it would upset the history of the apes. So he does what he can to destroy all the data. And I sometimes wonder if that could be what's going on. There's such perhaps a deep concern of something in our past so life-changing and dangerous and sinister and worrying, that somebody has essentially, or an organization has essentially self-censored itself and self-censored us in a strange way. In other words, hidden as much of this as possible to prevent from panic or chaos from occurring. And, and that kind of, sort of runs in with a parallel from Planet of the Apes, the idea that getting rid of science and history is a good thing. And when you start going down that path, that's really dangerous, when you start to modify history,
Well, I suspect, what do you think, Andy? I think that probably most of us could handle it if these things were revealed.
I think individually we might be able to, but I do saying before, if it starts to knock on things like people's faiths and beliefs, then that can be a problem. I can see, you only need a few people to start to overreact, for people to kind of create a wave effect of people panicking about these things and what does it mean for us. I think as individuals, I think people like us, us three, kind of a bit more in tune with this kind of thing, would handle it much better. But I think the average Joe public would probably have a bit of a meltdown over that kind of change of their understanding of one's own identity. Particularly if you are talking about something that may have come from the ancient past and affected us here in our development, that really does make you start to question yourself. You would find yourself thinking, well, what are my origins then? Not just as a person, as a species. And I think that would have an adverse effect. And I think that's one of the reasons why perhaps if governments do have some information which they don't let out because they don't fully understand, because they are concerned on how it would impact us. So, I think some people would be okay, but I think it would cause a problem for a lot of people. So I'm not so sure.
And if, those, I'll have to do some research. The photographs that they were showing on Coast to Coast, I think they were legitimate. And some of them really looked like, I've been out to the rock quarries and found brachiopods and trilobites and so forth. But some of them looked like, and if it's true, it suggests a parallel with Mars. And I'm looking at some of these images here, but I'll have to check them out later. Yes. So I guess we'll wrap it up then. And again, I want to highly recommend your book. And people, by the way, so Nick, tell people where to contact you and where to find your books.
Well, the book's called The Martians and subtitled Evidence of Life on the Red Planet, and it's just been out about 2 months, and you can get it on Amazon, and you can also get it off the shelves in Barnes & Noble in the United States. And as far as myself's concerned, I have a blog called World of Whatever, and you can reach me there. And there have been times when I've been sort of every day posting, and other days when I'm not. So when you go there, you'll see it's a little bit staggered. But I always sort of try and, every few days update it with some of the more intriguing stories. And you can also reach me at Facebook as well. There's a bunch of Nick Redferns, but just type me in and you'll see me. So.
And a very cool recent picture, by the way. I also, before we close, and Andy, if you want to get anything else in here, please do. I wanted a personal thank you. You and I talked a few years ago at the UFO Contact event at Houghton Lake, Michigan. Nice little resort area there. And while I went to high school with Methuselah, I was still kind of the new kid on the block. And so you graciously came to see my talk, and you even gave me a nice shout out when you gave your talk. So I just really appreciated your support.
But you're welcome.
And
joking aside, I mean, it is all, I like the fact that when we can all get together, and as a unit, and but not just colleagues, but friends as well. I think that's sort of, the way it should be. And
Well, there's nothing better than a conference dealing with some aspect of the unknown and the unexplained.
Well, see, that's the thing we're so kind of lacking over here in the UK. I mean, there's a few that go on up north. There's a friend of mine runs one quite regularly, but it's well up north. There's very little down here in the southeast, and it's a real shame. I keep saying to Stephen that one of these days I'm going to get over there and come over an entire conference season and just joining, because you do feel a bit left out over here, which is a bit of a shame, especially when our better writers decide to leave the UK and head off to the States, Mr. Redfern.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of conferences, in the US. I mean, all the time, whether it's US, well, not now, obviously, with the virus. Yeah. But I mean, normally, you've got UFO conferences, conspiracy, ghost conferences, and, pretty much every other weekend, maybe somewhere every weekend. And we're talking about, audiences of 300 to 400, and some of them more than that. So that there is a good scene, and
unfortunately, it's all over there.
Yeah. Although some of us toward the east don't get to the ones on the west and so forth, so we do get a little stretched out. But being in southern Michigan here, I've been, I can get to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Pittsburgh, and even west out to Van Meter for the Van Meter Visitor Festival. So there's a lot of opportunities. And my first, I went to the 1976 MUFON Symposium where Dr. Hynek spoke in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But years later, I went to my first Mothman Festival in 2006, and I was just in heaven, because when you're isolated and your colleagues at work, you can talk to some of them maybe, but like Nick says, it's the friendship, it's the camaraderie, and you can talk to people that don't look at you sideways, which is kind of nice. The Roger Corman film, Attack of the Crab Monsters, is in my head right now.
Funny enough, here I keep hearing the beginning of Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds in my head every few
minutes. Oh, yeah. Good
we
stuff.
Talk about, especially I do the invaders from Mars, and they go, oh my God, yeah.
Well,
Nick, thank you very much for being here tonight. I really enjoyed it.
No, well, thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground and ideas and concepts, which is always sort of a good thing when you're sort of dealing, with things like this. It's just a fascinating. Whatever the answer is, either way, it's going to be fascinating. But I just hope, in our lifetimes, we'll get the answers, or somebody's got the answers and they'll come tumbling out, whether deliberately or by mistake,
Right. And Andy, I'm glad you were here tonight to talk to Nick and for your reunion after 4 years.
Yes. It's funny.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. Sit tight for just a minute. I'm going to do my closeout and we'll wrap it up. Sure. Again, thanks to Nick Redfern and Andy Mercer for being here. And definitely you want to check out Nick's books. Some of my favorites are the Contactees, Three Men Seeking Monsters, Black Diary, the Men in Black books, and it goes on and on. The High Strangeness Factor was created by Steve Ward and Andy Mercer and is copyrighted by the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I want to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, who, of course, are our fearless leaders here at the network. And I want to thank Andy again for his tireless efforts as producer for the show. And also Brian Zeller, who composed the original music for the High Strangeness Factor. I can also be heard on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files as a correspondent every week on this same network. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank here on Paranormal UK Radio. Thanks for listening, and I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care.